The entire dealership had given up. A rare hypercar worth over $2 million sat silent in the center of the garage after 6 weeks of failed diagnostics. Its hood open like a wound that refused to close. Engineers had flown in from 3 different states. Specialists had charged fortunes just to shake their heads and walk away. Nobody could find the problem. And nobody wanted to admit it out loud. Then, in the quiet hours when the garage lights dimmed and the cleaning crew took over, a poor single dad working as a night janitor quietly asked one question that nobody expected to hear from a man holding a mop. "Has anyone checked the mechanical timing manually?" he said, almost to himself. As if he were thinking aloud rather than speaking to the room, the technicians laughed. The owner laughed too, covering her mouth with perfectly manicured fingers, more amused than offended. But the next morning, the impossible happened. The dead engine roared back to life, filling the garage with a sound that silenced every single person standing there. And when the millionaire owner discovered who had fixed it, and why he knew more about that engine than her entire engineering team combined, she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her professional life. Ethan Parker was 38 years old, and most of the people who worked alongside him at Aurora Motors knew almost nothing about him beyond the fact that he showed up every night at 9, pushed his cart of cleaning supplies through the service bay with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this exact routine for years, and left before the sun came up without saying more than a handful of words to anyone. His uniform was always clean but clearly old, the fabric softened by countless washes. A small tear near the left cuff that he had mended himself with thread that didn't quite match. The other employees, the ones who wore crisp polos with the Aurora Motors emblem stitched in gold thread, tended to look past him the way people look past furniture. A few of the younger technicians had nicknamed him Ghost, not unkindly, just because he seemed to move through the building without leaving a trace, finishing his work and disappearing into the night shift schedule, like he was trying not to be noticed at all. There was a rumor that followed him quietly through the building. One of those stories that nobody could confirm, but everyone seemed to have heard a version of. Someone said he used to run his own company. Someone else said he lost everything after a partner cheated him out of a deal worth millions. A mechanic named Russell Cole, who had been at Aurora longer than almost anyone, claimed he once saw Ethan glance at an open hood with an expression that didn't belong on a janitor's face, something closer to longing than curiosity. But whenever anyone tried to ask Ethan directly about his past, he would offer a small, polite smile, say something vague about bad luck and bad timing, and change the subject before the conversation could go any further. He never talked about the company he used to run. He never talked about the engineering degree sitting in a box somewhere, or the patents with his name on them that had once been worth more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. He simply showed up, did his work, and went home to the small apartment where his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was usually already asleep by the time he walked through the door. Victoria Hayes, by contrast, was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone else feel slightly underdressed. At 36, she had inherited her father's dealership empire 2 years earlier after his sudden retirement, and in that time, she had transformed Aurora Motors from a respected regional chain into one of the most recognized luxury automotive groups on the entire eastern seaboard. She was beautiful in the deliberate, controlled way of someone who had learned early that appearance was currency, and she was sharp enough that competitors twice her age had learned not to underestimate her. But beneath the composed exterior, Victoria was carrying a weight that very few people in the company were allowed to see. The dealership's flagship location was facing the most serious crisis of her career, one that threatened not just a single deal, but the entire reputation she had spent years building from the ground up. A client named Marcus Whitfield, a reclusive collector known across the industry for owning some of the rarest vehicles ever produced, had brought his hypercar to Aurora Motors for what should have been a routine service. Instead, the engine had simply stopped responding, refusing every diagnostic the team threw at it, and Whitfield was not a man known for his patience. He had made it clear, through his assistant, that if Aurora Motors could not resolve the issue within a reasonable window, he would not only pull the vehicle, but would also cancel a separate, far larger order. one involving an entire fleet of limited edition vehicles worth tens of millions of dollars, a deal that Victoria had spent the better part of a year negotiating. The pressure had been building for 6 weeks, and every day the car sat untouched in the center of the garage felt like another nail being driven into the company's reputation. That $2 million hypercar had become something of a legend within the walls of Aurora Motors before Ethan ever laid a hand on it. It was a single rebuilt prototype model, one of only a handful in existence, modified with a custom hybrid powertrain that very few mechanics in the country had any real experience with. When the engine first failed to start, the lead technician, a confident man named Derek Sullivan, who had built his reputation on solving problems other shops couldn't touch, assured Victoria it would be a simple fix, something electrical, something he could resolve within a day or two. A day or two turned into a week. A week turned into a month. Sullivan brought in 2 engineers from the manufacturer itself, men who had actually helped design the hybrid system, and even they left scratching their heads, muttering about sensor failures and software conflicts that didn't seem to explain what they were actually seeing. Victoria authorized whatever resources were needed. She brought in independent specialists from out of state, men who charged thousands of dollars simply to walk through the door and inspect the vehicle before offering an opinion. Each one arrived with confidence and left with a different theory. One suspected a corrupted firmware update. Another insisted the battery management system had a manufacturing defect. A third spent 4 days convinced the problem lived somewhere in the wiring harness, only to find nothing after tearing half the dashboard apart and putting it back together with visible frustration. Every theory led to a dead end, and every dead end cost Aurora Motors both money and credibility, because word travels fast in a world where the wealthy talk to each other, and Marcus Whitfield was not a man who kept his complaints quiet. Victoria began spending her evenings standing in the garage long after the regular staff had gone home, staring at the open hood as if the engine itself might eventually confess its secret out of sheer exhaustion. She had built her career on confidence and control, on making decisions quickly and trusting her instincts. But this situation was eroding both. She would run her fingers along the edge of the workbench, replaying conversations with engineers who clearly didn't have an answer but were too proud to say so plainly. And she would wonder, in the quietest part of her mind, whether this single failure might undo everything her father had spent 30 years building. It was during one of those long evenings that she first noticed Ethan. Though notice was perhaps too strong a word. He was simply present, moving through the bay with his cart, wiping down surfaces, emptying bins, present in the way the overhead lights were present, functional and unremarkable. But Victoria, exhausted and increasingly desperate, found herself glancing toward him more than once, not because she suspected anything, but because everyone else in the building had started to blur together into a single chorus of failed explanations, and he was simply the only person in the room who wasn't talking. Derek Sullivan and his team had gathered around the open engine bay for what felt like the 100th time, running through yet another diagnostic sequence on a laptop connected to the vehicle's onboard computer. The screen displayed lines of data that meant nothing to anyone outside the small circle of specialists who understood the hybrid system's architecture. Sullivan rubbed his temples and admitted, in a voice tight with frustration, that the sensor readings looked clean, the software looked clean, and yet the engine refused to turn over in any meaningful way. One of the visiting engineers suggested they might need to replace the entire control module, a repair that would cost nearly $200,000 and still offered no guarantee of success. Ethan had been working a few yards away, sweeping near the tool chests, close enough to hear fragments of the conversation without anyone particularly noticing or caring that he could hear them at all. He paused for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the open hood, taking in the layout of the engine with an attention that no one in that room would have expected from someone holding a broom. He noticed something in the way the engineers kept circling back to the same electronic systems, running the same tests with slightly different parameters, as if they were certain the answer lived somewhere in the code, and simply hadn't found the right combination of numbers yet. He recognized that posture, that mindset, because he had once trained engineers to think exactly that way himself, back when his own name carried weight in rooms like this one. He didn't say anything that day, He finished his sweeping, emptied the last of the trash bins, and clocked out at his usual hour, walking home through streets that had grown familiar over the past several years, past the same convenience store, the same bus stop bench where teenagers gathered on weekends, until he reached the modest apartment building where Lily was waiting with a babysitter who lived 2 doors down. He made her dinner, helped her with a reading assignment, and tucked her into bed. And if anyone had asked him in that moment whether he thought about the hypercar sitting silent in the Aurora Motors garage, he probably would have said no, even though some quiet part of his mind had already begun turning the problem over, the way it always did with machines that didn't make sense. The following week, the situation in the garage had grown more tense rather than less. Victoria had called an emergency meeting with Sullivan and the senior staff, and voices had begun to rise in ways that echoed through the open service bay. Sullivan insisted they were close to a breakthrough, that the latest firmware patch might finally resolve the conflict. But Victoria's patience had visibly thinned. She reminded the room, in a controlled but unmistakably sharp tone, that Marcus Whitfield's assistant had called that morning asking for an update, and that the silence on their end was being interpreted as incompetence rather than diligence. The word incompetence seemed to hang in the air a little too long, and several of the engineers exchanged uneasy glances. It was during this meeting, with frustration thick enough to taste, that Ethan happened to be passing through with a cart of fresh towels for the detailing station. He wasn't trying to insert himself into the conversation. He simply caught a phrase, "Has anyone checked the mechanical timing manually?" And the words left his mouth before he had fully decided to speak them. Almost involuntary, the way a doctor might wince at watching someone misdiagnose an obvious symptom, the room went quiet for half a second. And then, several of the engineers laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but with the easy dismissiveness of people who assumed the question came from someone who didn't understand what mechanical timing even meant in a system this advanced. Sullivan, in particular, found the comment amusing enough to repeat it to his colleagues with a small grin, asking whether the janitor had perhaps moonlighted as an engineer in another life. Victoria allowed herself a brief, tired laugh as well, more out of exhaustion than genuine humor, and gestured for Ethan to continue with his work, the way one might gently shoo away a well-meaning stranger who had wandered into the wrong conversation. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded, pushed his cart toward the detailing station, and let the moment pass without protest, though something in his expression, if anyone had been paying close enough attention, suggested he wasn't embarrassed so much as quietly certain of something the rest of the room had missed entirely. A young technician named Brian Foster, eager to seem clever in front of Sullivan, made a joke about hiring a custodian as a consultant, and the phrase "the janitor who fixes cars" began circulating through the garage as a kind of running gag over the following days. It wasn't said with real malice, but it carried that particular sting that comes from being reduced to a punchline in front of people who don't know anything real about you. Victoria, when she heard the phrase repeated later that week, didn't correct anyone. She assumed, reasonably enough given everything she knew about him, that Ethan was simply a man who liked machines in the casual way many people do, someone who might tinker with an old truck on weekends, but who couldn't possibly understand a system this sophisticated. Ethan, for his part, decided to ask a small favor the next evening, approaching one of the junior data technicians and requesting access to the diagnostic logs that had been recorded during the most recent testing session. He framed it carefully, almost apologetically, explaining that he was simply curious and wouldn't need more than a few minutes. The technician, uncertain whether this was even allowed, checked with Sullivan, who firmly declined the request, reminding everyone within earshot that the data was proprietary, and that unauthorized personnel touching sensitive client information could create serious liability issues for the company. Ethan accepted the answer without complaint, thanked the technician for checking, and returned to his cart, his expression unreadable. That night, after the building had emptied, and the only sounds left in the garage were the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the old structure settling, Ethan found himself standing in front of the hypercar again, mop forgotten against the nearest wall. Something about the layout of the engine bay had been nagging at him since the day he'd overheard Sullivan's team running through their tests. a small detail that seemed almost too simple to be the answer, which was precisely why he suspected it might be exactly that. He noticed, upon closer visual inspection, a slight discoloration along one section of the timing components, faint enough that someone scanning purely through computer diagnostics would never catch it because the sensors attached to that particular assembly were reporting normal values. It was the kind of inconsistency that only revealed itself to someone who had spent years working with their hands directly on engines before software diagnostics became the default approach to nearly everything. Ethan crouched lower, examining the assembly with the focused stillness of a man who had once spent entire nights in research labs, chasing exactly this kind of anomaly, the kind that doesn't show up in numbers but reveals itself in the subtle language of wear and friction. He thought back, almost without meaning to a project from nearly a decade earlier, back when he had been leading a team of engineers developing an experimental hybrid drivetrain for a startup he had co-founded with a man named Gregory Banks. That project had involved a similar mechanical synchronization challenge, one that had nearly derailed the entire prototype before Ethan personally traced the failure to a timing discrepancy so small that automated systems consistently failed to flag it. The memory arrived with an unwelcome sting, because that same project, the one he had poured years of his life and most of his savings into, was the very reason his name had quietly vanished from the engineering world afterward. Pushing the memory aside, Ethan returned to the garage the following evening after his shift officially ended, staying nearly 2 extra hours without pay, carefully and methodically disassembling the relevant section of the timing mechanism using tools he wasn't technically authorized to use. He moved with the practiced precision of someone who had done this exact kind of work 1,000 times before, his hands remembering motions his mind had tried to forget. By the time he finally stepped back from the engine, the eastern sky outside the garage's high windows had begun to lighten from black to a deep, bruised blue, and Ethan realized he had spent the entire night working without once checking the clock. He made the final mechanical adjustment just as the first technicians began arriving for the morning shift. And rather than explain himself or wait for permission, he simply reached for the ignition and turned the key, holding his breath in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. The engine roared to life with a sound so sudden and so powerful that it seemed to shake the entire garage, a deep, resonant growl that rolled through the concrete floor and up through the soles of everyone's shoes. Technicians who had been pouring coffee or checking their phones near the entrance came running, certain something had exploded, only to find Ethan standing calmly beside the hypercar as its engine settled into a smooth, confident idle, the kind of sound that any car enthusiast would recognize as flawless. Sullivan arrived moments later, his face draining of color as he realized what he was looking at, his mouth opening and closing twice before any actual words emerged. Victoria received the call before she had even finished her morning coffee, her assistant's voice tight, with something between disbelief and panic, insisting she needed to come to the garage immediately. She arrived within 20 minutes, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete as she crossed the bay, and the sight that greeted her stopped her mid-stride. The hypercar that had defeated every specialist for 6 straight weeks was sitting there, engine purring, with diagnostic readouts on Sullivan's laptop, showing numbers that hadn't appeared anywhere close to normal in over a month. Victoria's first instinct was disbelief bordering on suspicion, and she immediately asked who had been in the garage overnight, half expecting to hear that one of the outside specialists had snuck back in to finish the job quietly and claim credit later. Security footage was pulled within the hour, and what it showed left no room for alternative explanations. There, in grainy but unmistakable clarity, was Ethan, alone, working through the night with focused, deliberate movements, occasionally stepping back to study the engine before returning to his task. Never once checking his phone. Never once taking a break beyond a few sips of water from a bottle he'd brought from home. The garage fell into an uneasy, disbelieving silence as the footage played out on the monitor, technicians and engineers crowding around the screen as if watching some kind of impossible magic trick performed in slow motion. Sullivan, to his credit, didn't try to claim the work himself. though his expression suggested he was struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had assumed about the quiet man who emptied the trash bins each night. Victoria turned away from the screen and scanned the room until her eyes found Ethan, who was standing near the back, having quietly returned to restocking cleaning supplies as though nothing unusual had happened at all. She crossed the garage floor with the same deliberate confidence she carried into every important negotiation, stopping a few feet from him, studying his face for a long moment before finally speaking. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice quieter than the question seemed to deserve, stripped of the polished authority she usually carried into every conversation. Ethan met her gaze evenly, neither proud nor apologetic, and simply said that he used to build engines for a living a long time ago, before things changed. Victoria, sensing there was far more beneath that simple answer than he was willing to offer freely, told him she expected a full explanation, and not the kind he could deliver while holding a mop. That explanation, when Victoria finally pieced it together over the following days through a combination of careful questioning and her own private research, revealed a history that none of her staff, and certainly not Ethan himself, had ever volunteered. Nearly 12 years earlier, Ethan Parker had been one of the most promising young engineers in the hybrid powertrain industry, holding a degree from a respected engineering program and quickly distinguishing himself through a series of patents related to mechanical synchronization systems, the very kind of technology that had just saved a $2 million hypercar. He had co-founded a startup with Gregory Banks, a man with charisma and business connections but considerably less technical talent, and together they had built a company that briefly seemed destined for extraordinary success. The partnership had unraveled in a way that still occasionally visited Ethan in his sleep. Banks, facing mounting personal debts that Ethan hadn't known about until it was too late, had quietly diverted company funds while simultaneously negotiating a separate deal behind Ethan's back, one that ultimately stripped Ethan of his ownership stake through a series of contractual maneuvers that were technically legal but morally indefensible. By the time Ethan understood what had happened, the company had collapsed under the weight of mismanaged finances and broken investor trust, and his name, fairly or not, had become associated with the failure in industry circles that mattered for future employment. He had tried, for the better part of a year, to find work using his actual credentials, sending out applications to firms that once would have fought over him, only to discover that reputation in his field traveled faster and stuck harder than any explanation he could offer. Companies were polite but consistently uninterested, and savings that should have lasted years evaporated within months once Lily's mother left, unable or unwilling to handle the financial strain alongside everything else, leaving Ethan as a single father with a young daughter and a resume that suddenly worked against him rather than for him. He eventually stopped applying to engineering positions altogether and simply looked for any job that would let him pay rent and keep food on the table. Which was how he ended up, 3 years later, pushing a cleaning cart through the halls of Aurora Motors at 9 o'clock every night. Victoria's investigation into Ethan's past, conducted quietly through a contact in the automotive engineering community, uncovered something that struck far closer to home than she had anticipated. The very hybrid synchronization technology that Ethan had developed and patented over a decade earlier had not simply disappeared after his company's collapse. It had been sold through a chain of bankruptcy proceedings and asset transfers that obscured its true origin, eventually finding its way into the hands of a component supplier that Aurora Motors had partnered with years later, a partnership that had quietly become foundational to several of the dealership's most successful and profitable vehicle lines. The realization settled over Victoria slowly, and then all at once, the way certain truths do when they finally connect every loose thread into a single, undeniable picture. The man she had nearly fired for unauthorized work, the man her staff had openly mocked for weeks, was not simply talented in some abstract, sentimental way. He was, in a very real and traceable sense, one of the original architects behind technology that had helped build the very empire she now ran. She sat alone in her office that evening longer than usual, staring at printed documents that connected dots she wished she had never needed to find. Feeling something uncomfortably close to shame settle into her chest, that discomfort didn't remain private for long. Because word of Ethan's unauthorized overnight repair had already reached the dealership's board of directors, several of whom were far less interested in poetic justice than they were in liability and protocol. A board member named Harold Whitman, a stern man who had served on Aurora's board since Victoria's father ran the company, argued forcefully that allowing an unlicensed employee to perform unauthorized work on a client's $2 million vehicle, regardless of outcome, created an unacceptable legal exposure for the dealership. He insisted that Ethan be terminated immediately, both to limit liability and to send a clear message to the rest of the staff that procedures existed for a reason and could not simply be ignored because a gamble happened to pay off. Victoria found herself standing at a crossroads that felt heavier than any business decision she had faced since taking over the company. On one side stood the comfortable path of agreeing with her board, parting ways with Ethan quietly, absorbing whatever gratitude Marcus Whitfield offered for the repaired vehicle, and moving forward without further complication. On the other side stood an uncomfortable truth she could no longer unknow, the understanding that the man they wanted to dismiss had quietly contributed, through circumstances entirely outside his control, to the very success the board was now trying to protect. The boardroom meeting convened the following afternoon carried a tension that seemed to seep into the walls themselves, with Whitman opening the discussion by laying out, in clipped, formal language, the precise risks Ethan's actions had introduced. Another board member, a younger woman named Patricia Lynn, who generally aligned herself with whichever position seemed safest, added that allowing this kind of incident to become public could damage Aurora's image as a disciplined, professional organization, regardless of how the actual repair had turned out. Several others nodded along, more out of habit than conviction, creating an atmosphere where dissent seemed both unwelcome and unwise. Victoria, who had spent the morning rehearsing exactly how she wanted to present this, waited until the initial wave of criticism had run its course before standing and addressing the room directly. She explained, calmly and without embellishment, the full history she had uncovered, detailing Ethan's original company, the patents, the betrayal that had stripped him of everything, and the technology's quiet journey into the very systems that now powered several of Aurora's most successful vehicle lines. She watched the expressions around the table shift from irritation to something more complicated as the implications settled in, though Whitman remained visibly unconvinced, arguing that sentiment and procedure were two entirely different matters and that the company couldn't operate on stories, however compelling. The argument grew sharper from there, voices rising as Whitman insisted that precedent mattered more than gratitude, that other employees would expect similar leniency if rules could be bent this easily, and that Victoria's personal feelings about the situation were clouding sound business judgment. Victoria, refusing to back down for what felt like the first time in months, reminded the board that the company's reputation had been hours away from genuine disaster before Ethan's intervention, and that firing the one person who had saved them, simply because he had broken protocol while doing it, would send a far worse message than any procedural violation could. Ethan, who had been asked to wait outside during the deliberation, eventually stepped into the room when Victoria's assistant came to retrieve him. And the moment he sensed the weight of the conversation, he quietly offered to resign on his own terms, explaining that he didn't want to be the source of conflict within a company that had given him steady work when almost no one else would. Victoria refused before he could finish the sentence, telling him plainly that she had no intention of letting the board's discomfort erase what he had accomplished, and that if anyone was leaving the room frustrated today, it wasn't going to be him. What followed was a decision that surprised everyone in that boardroom, including, in some private corner of her own mind, Victoria herself. Rather than simply retaining Ethan as a regular employee with a quiet apology, she announced that she intended to place him in charge of an entirely new initiative, a research and development project focused on next-generation hybrid powertrain technology, one that Aurora Motors had been considering launching for over a year, but had never found the right leadership to drive forward. She framed it not as charity, but as strategy, arguing that a man with Ethan's original expertise, now armed with years of additional perspective gained from watching the industry from the outside, represented exactly the kind of asset most competitors would never think to look for. The room didn't erupt into applause, and Whitman in particular maintained a skeptical silence throughout the rest of the meeting, but no formal objection was raised strongly enough to override Victoria's authority as the company's majority owner. Within days, the decision had been finalized, and Ethan found himself, for the first time in over a decade, walking into a dedicated engineering office rather than a supply closet, staring at a blank whiteboard that was, for once, entirely his own to fill. The early weeks of the new project carried a strange, uneven energy, as Ethan worked to assemble a small team of engineers, several of whom had previously laughed alongside Sullivan at the idea of a janitor offering technical advice. Brian Foster, the young technician who had once joked about hiring custodians as consultants, found himself assigned directly to Ethan's team, an arrangement that initially produced visible discomfort on both sides. But Ethan, rather than holding the past against anyone, focused entirely on the work itself, walking Brian and the others through technical concepts with a patience and clarity that gradually began to shift the tone of every interaction. Within the first month, the team had identified a promising direction for the new powertrain design, building on principles Ethan had originally developed over a decade earlier, but refining them with insights drawn from years of advances in battery technology and materials science that simply hadn't existed back when his original company collapsed. Brian, who had initially approached the project with thinly veiled skepticism, found himself staying late on his own initiative, genuinely invested in solving problems that Ethan posed not as tests, but as collaborative puzzles. Slowly, the nickname Ghost faded from casual conversation around the dealership, replaced by something closer to quiet respect whenever his name came up. News of the breakthrough eventually reached beyond the walls of Aurora Motors, partly because Victoria, sensing both a genuine opportunity and a chance to reshape the public narrative around the company, encouraged a modest amount of press coverage once early prototype testing showed promising results. A regional business publication ran a short feature on the project, mentioning, almost as an afterthought, the unusual story of the lead engineer's path back into the industry after years away. The story spread further than anyone anticipated, picked up by a few automotive trade outlets curious about the technical details, and within weeks, Ethan's name, once quietly erased from professional relevance, began circulating again in spaces where it had once carried real weight. Throughout this period, Victoria found herself spending considerably more time in the engineering wing than her role technically required, often staying late to review progress reports that she could have simply received by email. She told herself, initially, that her continued presence was purely a matter of due diligence, given how publicly she had staked her judgment on this decision in front of the board. But the conversations gradually shifted from strictly professional updates into something looser and more personal. Ethan occasionally mentioning small details about Lily's school projects, Victoria sharing, more than she usually allowed herself to with employees, stories about the pressures of stepping into her father's role at such a young age. There was no single dramatic moment where their relationship shifted from professional respect into something warmer, but rather a slow accumulation of small exchanges. A shared laugh over a failed prototype test, a quiet conversation after a difficult board meeting where Ethan simply listened without offering unsolicited advice, a moment where Victoria realized she had begun looking forward to his updates, not purely for their technical content, but for the steady, grounded presence he brought into rooms that often felt chaotic. Neither of them named what was happening out loud, both wary, for entirely different reasons, of moving too quickly into something neither had expected to find in a workplace defined by hierarchy and formality. As the months passed, the prototype powertrain project reached a stage of development significant enough that Victoria decided to feature it prominently at Aurora Motors' annual industry gala, an event that traditionally drew manufacturers, major clients, journalists, and investors from across the region, serving as both a celebration and a strategic showcase for the company's upcoming direction. She made the decision carefully, aware that presenting the project publicly would also mean addressing, in some form, the unusual story behind its origin, a story that had already begun circulating informally, but had never been told fully or accurately in any public setting. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of polished, deliberate grandeur that Aurora Motors had become known for under Victoria's leadership. The main showroom transformed with soft lighting, elegant displays, and a stage positioned near the center where the company's most significant vehicles, past and present, were arranged like sculptures. Marcus Whitfield himself attended, along with representatives from several manufacturers Aurora partnered with, journalists covering the regional automotive industry, and a substantial portion of the dealership's own staff, many of whom had played some role, large or small, in the story that was about to be told. Ethan arrived wearing a suit that Victoria had quietly arranged to have tailored for him, a detail he hadn't asked for, and initially resisted before relenting at her insistence that he simply allow himself, for one evening, to be seen the way his work actually deserved. He stood near the back of the room for most of the early program, uncomfortable with attention in a way that years of public invisibility had only deepened. Watching as Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting partners and clients with the same composed confidence she always carried, though anyone who knew her well might have noticed a slight nervousness beneath the surface as the evening progressed. When Victoria finally stepped onto the stage to deliver her remarks, the room settled into the particular hush that accompanies an audience expecting routine corporate messaging, polite applause for quarterly numbers and future projects. She began conventionally enough, thanking partners and clients for their continued trust, before shifting, deliberately, into a different register entirely, describing the night 6 weeks of failed diagnostics had nearly cost the company a defining client relationship, and the morning a problem that an entire team of specialists couldn't solve was quietly resolved overnight by someone almost nobody in that room had ever properly noticed. She didn't dramatize the story beyond what it deserved, simply laying out the sequence of events plainly, the mockery Ethan had endured, the years of struggle that had led him to that garage in the first place, and the technology, born from his own original work over a decade earlier, that had quietly become part of the very foundation Aurora Motors now stood upon. She paused, scanning the room until she found him standing near the back, and asked him, in front of every partner, client, and employee gathered there, to come forward. Ethan hesitated for a moment before making his way toward the stage, the room's attention settling onto him in a way that felt almost disorienting after years of deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of visibility. Victoria met him at the edge of the platform and, without unnecessary flourish, announced that effective immediately, he would be stepping into the role of co-head of engineering for Aurora Motors' technical division, a position created specifically to recognize both his historical contributions to the industry and his leadership on the project that now represented the company's future direction. The applause that followed began slowly, almost hesitantly, before building into something sustained and genuine. Employees who had once dismissed him rising to their feet alongside clients and partners who understood, in that moment, exactly what kind of story they had just witnessed unfold in real time. Sullivan, standing near the front, clapped longer than almost anyone. His earlier skepticism, long since replaced by something closer to genuine admiration. Brian Foster, watching from the engineering team's section, allowed himself a proud, unguarded smile. Having spent the better part of a year, learning directly from the man he had once mocked, without a second thought, Victoria, before stepping away from the microphone, added one final remark that she hadn't fully planned, but that felt necessary in that moment, acknowledging openly that she had judged Ethan, like many others in the room had, based entirely on his appearance and his circumstances, without bothering to ask who he actually was or what he had actually known. She said it plainly, without excessive sentiment, simply stating it as a mistake she had made and corrected, a small but honest admission that seemed to land more powerfully with the room than any rehearsed speech could have managed. Later that evening, once the formal program had ended and the crowd had thinned into smaller scattered conversations near the bar and the display vehicles, Ethan found himself standing near a quiet corner of the showroom with Victoria, both of them finally free from the weight of public attention for the first time that night. Neither spoke for a moment, simply standing together in the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the past several months, until Victoria finally asked, quietly, whether he had ever imagined his life turning out this way again. Ethan admitted he hadn't, not for a long time, and that he had mostly stopped allowing himself to hope for anything beyond steady work and a stable home for his daughter. Victoria told him, with more openness than she usually permitted herself in conversation, that she was glad circumstances had forced her, however reluctantly at first, to actually see him clearly, and that she didn't intend to let that clarity fade now that the spotlight had moved elsewhere. There was no dramatic declaration that night. No sweeping romantic gesture befitting a gala evening. Simply two people who had each carried their own private burdens for years, finally allowing themselves a small, honest moment of connection, grounded in genuine respect rather than performance. In the months that followed, Aurora Motors' new powertrain division grew into one of the company's most closely watched projects within the broader industry, attracting interest from manufacturers eager to license the technology and journalists curious about the unusual leadership story behind it. Ethan settled into his new role with the same quiet diligence he had once brought to mopping garage floors, though now his daughter Lily occasionally visited the office after school, sitting at a spare desk doing homework while her father reviewed engineering reports a few feet away. A routine that would have seemed impossible to imagine just a year earlier. Victoria and Ethan's relationship developed slowly and deliberately over the following months, neither rushing toward labels or grand gestures, instead building something steady through shared dinners after long workdays, weekend visits to Lily's school events, and the kind of quiet partnership that comes from two people who have each, in their own way, learned the cost of moving too quickly through important things. Their colleagues noticed, of course, the way office gossip tends to notice everything eventually, but the speculation remained gentle and largely affectionate, a quiet acknowledgement that something good had grown out of circumstances that could have just as easily ended in bitterness. Sullivan, in an unexpected turn that surprised even himself, became one of Ethan's most reliable collaborators within the engineering division, the early mockery between them, eventually settling into a working relationship built on mutual respect, even something resembling friendship as the months passed. Brian Foster, having absorbed years of practical knowledge directly from Ethan, eventually earned a promotion of his own, frequently telling newer employees, half-jokingly but with clear sincerity, that the most important lesson he'd learned at Aurora Motors had nothing to do with engines at all, but with never assuming you know someone's whole story, just because you've seen one small part of it. Aurora Motors itself continued to expand under Victoria's leadership. The near disaster with Marcus Whitfield's hypercar, eventually becoming something closer to company legend than crisis, a story occasionally told to new hires during their first week, as an informal reminder that the people you overlook are sometimes exactly the people who end up saving you. Whitfield himself remained a loyal client for years afterward, occasionally requesting, with a wry smile, that Ethan personally oversee the service of any future vehicle he brought to the dealership, a small running joke between two men who had, in their own ways, both benefited from a night that almost nobody saw coming. Ethan Parker eventually became something of a quiet symbol within the industry, not through any deliberate effort at recognition, but simply through the steady, undeniable consistency of his work and the unusual path that had led him back to it. People who had once dismissed him as nothing more than the man who emptied the trash bins came to understand, gradually and then completely, that resilience often looks unremarkable right up until the moment it doesn't, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who actually understands what's happening, and that judging someone by the uniform they wear rather than the knowledge they carry is a mistake that can cost far more than anyone expects until it's too late to take back. Victoria, for her part, found in Ethan not just a brilliant engineer who had unexpectedly saved her company from disaster, but a partner whose steadiness complemented the relentless ambition that had defined her entire adult life, someone who understood, in a way few others around her ever had, what it meant to lose everything and rebuild it slowly, deliberately, without ever losing sight of what actually mattered. And somewhere in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of evenings spent reviewing engineering reports together, of weekend mornings spent at Lily's soccer games, of a partnership built not on first impressions, but on the slow, patient work of actually seeing one another clearly, both of them found something neither had expected to find again. A life rebuilt from the wreckage of old mistakes, standing stronger and more honest than either version of it had ever managed to be before.